Hello everyone! Welcome to our Nautilus Facebook Live event, where we give you the opportunity to ask any questions you may have about the ship and our exploration season. So, without further ado, allow me to introduce Sam and Adam, two members of our Corps of Exploration on board the EV Nautilus right now. How's it going on the ship, guys?
Hi everyone, excellent, and welcome aboard Exploration Vessel Nautilus. We're here in the ship studio, and I am here with Dr. Adam Sewell from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Adam, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Adam Sewell from Hui, as Sam said, and we're out here in the Gulf of California exploring the seafloor, and it's been an amazing trip so far.
Yeah, so we are taking your questions, send them in. We're going to give you a little overview of what we've been up to out here on the ship, as well as take you through the ship via some of the shipboard cameras. So my name is Samantha Wishnak. I'm the communications lead out here on Nautilus. And send in your questions on Facebook. We're very curious to hear what we can tell you more about our expedition season. We've been exploring since May. Started up in British Columbia, Canada, and worked our way down the coast from Washington, Oregon, all the way down to California, and now in Baja California, Mexico. And our season goes until November 20th. So there's a lot of exploration that's coming up. We are exploring hydrothermal vent communities right now, and then in the next week, we'll be staying here in the Gulf of California and then heading offshore to the Revillagigedo archipelago, so about 300 miles offshore the Baja California peninsula, where we'll be returning to a site that we did some seafloor mapping around 2 islands in that region earlier this year. So really excited about this season, but we want to give you more information about what we've been up to recently. So Adam, what's our expedition goals? What have our expedition goals been like this season, or this expedition?
Yeah, so this expedition, we're in a place called Guaymas Basin in the Gulf of California. This is a mid-ocean ridge spreading center, and it's covered with a thick blanket of sediment. So when we've been out here, we've seen an amazing diversity of seafloor vents. We've seen seafloor vents that are very hot, over 300 degrees Celsius, spewing out black smoke. And we've seen sites that are cold, the same temperature as the ocean water around them, and sites that are in between, kind of warm. And at each of these sites, we see a different ecosystem. We see different animals there. We collect the rocks, the animals, and the fluids that are coming out of these sites to try and understand why, in such a small area, we get this huge diversity of seafloor vent sites.
And Adam, we are kind of completing a dive right now, right?
Yeah, that's right. So in today's dive, we were at one of the colder sites, sometimes called a cold seep. And one of the reasons we found this site is that some of the technology on the ship is a multi-beam sonar. So it acoustically sends a pulse out into the ocean. And from that, we found a plume of bubbles rising off the seafloor. So we went down to the seafloor at this area, and we found little trickles of gas bubbles coming up. At the moment, we collected those in a cylinder, and at the moment, we're coming up from the bottom, waiting for that gas to expand, and then we're going to collect some of it in a special sample chamber so that we can analyze it back on the deck of the ship.
Yeah, so we are kind of in ascent to the surface. We're about a little over 600 meters from the surface, and actually conducting an experiment on Hercules on the way up, which is kind of neat. Now we actually have some questions rolling in, which is great. One from Lisa on Facebook. How close can we get to the hot vents, and might Hercules melt any parts on board?
Yeah, so the temperature, as I mentioned, over 300 degrees Celsius, and that's quite hot, but a lot of the tools that we use to get real close to those vents are made of titanium, so that is not going to melt if we get that close. And the other thing is, as soon as it comes out of the vent, it mixes with the cold seawater. So when you're only 10 centimeters away, your temperature is down to just a few degrees Celsius.
Yeah. And what about around some of the seeps? I know we've been experiencing different temperature levels around different types of venting systems.
Yeah, so in addition to those high temperature vents at 300 degrees, we found some vents that are around 80 degrees. And so the fluids that are coming out of them don't have the black smoke that the high temperature systems do. What instead you see this very clear shimmering water coming out of the vents.
So, Adam, right before lunch, you were up in the control van. What was that experience like while you were exploring, looking for these seeps and bubble plumes? on the control van aboard Nautilus.
Yeah, it's actually really exciting, even for someone who's done it many times before. You know that there's something on the seafloor you're looking for, and you're really just looking at it's like taking a flashlight into a dark stadium. You can only see a few meters around you, so you have to be kind of systematic in how you move around the seafloor, look for signals that you see. So in the instance of this vent site, one of the first things you see are a bunch of clam shells. So the clams like where the fluid's coming out of the seafloor, and at the edges of these sites you see a bunch of clam shells from dead clams, and as you move closer you see live clams. Then you start to see bacterial mats, clumps of tube worms, and pretty soon you can find these places where the bubbles are coming up.
Yeah, those tube worm communities have just been incredible.
Oh my gosh, and we've seen different types of tube worms occupying these different vent sites. So at the high temperature vents we've seen Riftia tube worms. These are giant tube worms. They can grow to several meters in length, and they have these bright red plumes that stick out the top. And at these colder sites, we see different types of tube worms, Lamellobrachia, for example, smaller, a little more spindly, but they look like kind of bushes. They almost look like kind of plants growing on the seafloor.
So we have a question from Kelly wondering, what kind of samples have we taken?
Well, on this leg, we've taken fluid samples using specialized sample chambers that keep the fluid at high pressure. We've collected rocks using Hercules manipulator. We've collected a bunch of different kinds of animals, tube worms, snails, clams. We've also used a device called a push cord. This is just an empty tube that you push into the sediment, it fills with sediment, and you bring it back up. The other tools we use are scoops. Sometimes for the anemones we collected just the other day, we had to use a scoop to get those. And we also have some really cool technology that's like bringing a chemistry lab down to the seafloor, a mass spectrometer and a laser spectrometer that make these measurements of the fluids right on the seafloor. So in addition to collecting a sample and bringing it up, we have the tools to make those measurements on the seafloor as well.
Great. Well, we've got a lot of folks tuning in who are super curious about these vent systems. Anusha asks, how different are the compositions of fluid from the varying types of vents?
Yeah, so from what we've seen so far, all the fluids have high concentrations of methane. That's coming from the decomposition of organic matter in the sediments. The hot vents, the high temperature vents, have a whole lot of sulfide in them. That's why they make black smoke. The sulfide is dissolved in the fluid, and once it comes out and cools off and gets oxygenated, little minerals precipitate from the fluid. At the warm site, 80 degrees or so, we still see a lot of methane, but we don't see any sulfide, and that's one of the reasons we don't see the black smoke at that site.
Interesting. Now, on board, once Hercules returns to the surface, we have all these samples in sample boxes, in the push cores, in the Niskin bottles for water samples, in the flush, or in the
slurp chambers.
Slurp chambers,
Yeah,
thank you. I was
right.
thinking of a very official name. Anything we've collected with a suction hose, the slurp. So what are we doing with all of these samples once we're back on board Hercules?
Yeah, it's really the hard work begins once you get the vehicle on the deck, because all of these samples need to be documented, photographed, for example, described, and for the biological specimens preserved. For the fluid samples, they need to be analyzed. So, even though you might be able to get all the samples off that vehicle in an hour or so, there's many hours of work that go into cataloging those, and there'll be many more hours of work back on shore to do deeper analysis of the samples.
Yeah, we were working with, in addition to Woods Hole, we're also collecting samples for the University of Mexico, who has a scientist on board right now, biologist.
Yeah, UNAM, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico.
Perfect.
Yeah, and we have so collaborators from that university. We have folks out here from University of Rhode Island, and we have a bunch of scientists ashore, which is one of the neat features of Nautilus, is that all of our information can be transmitted back to shore in real time, so scientists ashore can see what we're looking at and make suggestions about what samples to collect. So folks from Harvard have been watching, and a bunch of different universities, and folks tuning in from around the world, really.
Yeah, really the coolest thing about Nautilus is that the same live stream that we're watching here aboard the ship is the same one that's being broadcast around the world. So, once this Facebook Live is over, you can go on to nautiluslive.org and actually be watching as we're exploring live. We are recovering the vehicles right now, so you'll see our back deck and you'll see all of our teams, quickly sort of trying to turn around the vehicles to get to our next dive site. But that feed is exactly what the scientists ashore are watching too.
Yeah, and on that, when you're watching that feed, you can write in with questions, and the scientists and engineers who are using the vehicle love to spend time answering them. There's a lot of time where you're just kind of looking at the screen, seeing what's happening, so there's plenty of time to discuss what we're seeing and help people around the world understand why we do deep sea research, why we do exploration, and what we're trying to learn.
So we have a perfect follow-up question. Suzanne is wondering if there's something specific we're looking for in this exploration, or just trying to gain more general knowledge of the area.
Yeah, those two things are not mutually exclusive. We have specific questions that we're trying to ask. What are the origin of these fluids? Why are they different at this site versus that site? How do the animal communities respond to the differences in fluid chemistry and temperature? But anytime you go to the seafloor, you're doing some amount of exploration and trying to learn what's there. The seafloor is, vastly underexplored relative to what we know about land, and so anytime you go down, there's a very high likelihood you're going to see something new.
Absolutely. So what are some of the newer sightings we've seen? What's been unexpected for you as a submarine volcanologist who studies this kind of environment?
One of the things generally that's unexpected is the real diversity of venting that we see in a small area. Sam mentioned that we're heading later in the season 300 miles offshore to another site. Within 10 or 20 miles, we have vents that are, real hot and real cold, and so the diversity has been really surprising. And the hot sites that we went to have been spectacular. Just seeing the chimney structures that in some cases are 25 meters high, and the communities of tube worms that are there is always astounding, anytime you get to see it.
Absolutely. We have some folks who are very curious about the experiment that's going on right now on the front porch of Hercules. Curious about if the bubbles, Kim is curious if the bubbles are going to get all the way to the surface or if they'll dissolve and escape along the way.
Yeah, the bubbles that come out of the seafloor don't make it all the way to the surface. There's a competition between the expansion of the bubbles as you heat them up and you relieve the pressure on them, but also seawater doesn't have a lot of methane in it, so that methane is going to dissolve back into the seawater. These bubbles, there's a possibility that they could make it all the way to the surface because we've really limited their exposure to seawater by keeping them in that capsule.
Are there any bets being taken among the science team?
This is the second time we've tried this experiment. Our first bubble capture device had a number of leaks in it, so they didn't make it to the surface. They came out the top. So I think the scientists are just pleased that so far we've trapped that gas.
That's awesome. This is one of the things I love about Nautilus is that, you are actually able to see how sometimes you try something, it doesn't work, you have to iterate again, you have to, continually be modifying the tools you're using in order to achieve the results.
Yeah, the oceanographic community is, some of the original kind of makerspace communities. This is this little bubble trap device is put together from various parts of different other instruments, and it's working well at the moment.
Yeah, sometimes you'll see on the front porch of Herc some kind of interesting implements, kitchen knives, or we had at one point the T-Boss, which was the toilet brush of science, scoops, whatever we can find. Since we're out here in the middle of the ocean, we don't have a hardware store we can run to, so you'll often find us getting a little creative with what we're using. Now, Adam, your team out here right now is composed of, you're a volcanologist, you're a geologist. You have as well a couple of folks out from Hui who are working on some of the mass spectrometer, laser spectrometer as biogeochemists and as tech folks. What about the rest of the team that you're working with right now?
Yeah, so almost every oceanographic expedition is multidisciplinary, and part of that is because it's so difficult to get out to these sites that all the disciplines of oceanographic science want to be there and help understand it. So there are biologists out here right now. There are chemists, there are engineers, there are geologists, and it's great because we're all working together. The geologists might have an understanding of what's happening in the subsurface and why the fluids are coming up, but the chemists are the ones who can tell us exactly what the composition of those fluids are, and the biologists can tell us if this community is unique to this site and the like. So it's really a gratifying way to do the science when you come out here, because you don't only think about the discipline that you are trained in, but you learn a lot about the biology and the chemistry as well.
And we have an incredible team who's behind the scenes, our video engineering team, who is holding the cameras outside that you're able to enjoy the deck view from. Our video team is up in the control van focusing the cameras, making sure that all of that video feed is going out to the world looking fantastic. We also actually have a production team on land back at the University of Rhode Island as well. So it's pretty incredible how many different disciplines and different types of jobs and roles are required to send something like this out to the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Not to mention the folks who run the ship and keep that working well. That you can't come out and do this work unless you have a ship to do it on. So we're super appreciative of everyone's kind of max effort that they put into out here to get the job done.
Exactly. And we also have lots of opportunities for people who have not been out to sea before. We have science and engineering internships for undergraduate and graduate students in ocean science, in seafloor mapping, in ROV engineering, and in video engineering. So right now we've got a couple of interns out who are learning from professionals in the field. Nautilus is a training ship, and so we are able to partner students with industry professionals, which is a pretty fantastic and unique experience. We also have a science communication fellowship program that I'll mention for informal and formal educators. So that's actually how I came out on Nautilus last year. Fantastic way to come out and really understand what exploration is all about and be able to communicate that with classrooms and museum and aquarium audiences around the world. So I'll post links right there in the Facebook page.
Yeah, and it's one of the important things is everyone out here has a job and some responsibilities that take up basically all their waking hours. That there isn't anyone who can do everything out here, and you really need a team to do it because the operations happen around the clock. We have dives that start at 8 a.m. We have dives that start at 2 a.m. You never know for sure exactly when it's going to come up, when things are going to break or go smoothly. So the team is really essential to making the operation work and get the best science and exploration done.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of science and exploration, we've got a lot of questions coming in. Two questions sort of related. One from Heather asking about if our research relates to astrobiology and the search for life on faraway moons like Enceladus. Enceladus?
Enceladus.
Enceladus.
Yeah.
Enceladus sounds like the Spanish pronunciation, perhaps. And then one from Annette wondering if we're finding unusual and new life forms near the vents and if they could be examined to possibly have medical or health benefits.
Yeah, those are great questions. So the question about astrobiology and life on other planets, it's really kind of remarkable what we're learning about these ocean worlds out there. So moons of Jupiter and Saturn that have an icy shell on them, but now we know they have an ocean beneath that ice, and that ocean is salty just like our own ocean. The vents that we're looking at may have some similarities to what's happening on those planets. We think there's hydrothermal circulation going on there, sometimes driven by heat, but maybe more driven by reactions between the water and the rocks. So the fundamental processes that we're observing may be the same as are happening on these other planets. So thinking about how the organisms on the seafloor live off the chemical energy in those fluids rather than than sunlight up on land, I think has direct relevance to what's happening on those other planets. Not to mention the way that we explore them, the way that we get down to the seafloor. That operation may be something that's in our children's or our children's lifetime, to take vehicles, something similar to Hercules or other robotic vehicles to these other planets and explore the seafloor. And Annette asked about biomedical applications. That's something we're not doing specifically, but by going out here and collecting the samples and determining what's there, there's no, or it's possible that we're going to find brand new organisms. These organisms live at the extremes of life, both in terms of pressure and temperature, and because of those adaptations, may have developed or evolved to have compounds in them that may have some benefit to humans.
Now, what's the time frame on sort of learning about these new species or collecting the new species and then actually learning that they are indeed new species?
Yeah, so it doesn't often happen immediately. Largely, in order to kind of verify that it's a new species, we're going to have to get the genetic material. So that's something that's going to happen back on shore. And the larger fauna that we see are things that people have looked at for a long time just because it's been easy to see them and grab them. What usually ends up as a new species might be stuff that's not visible to the naked eye in terms of bacteria or microbes, or it might be some of the smaller infauna that live amongst the larger animals.
Our frequent Nautilus viewers might remember from last year a little purple orb that we found off the coast of Southern California. At the time, it totally stumped our team. You can hear in the replay videos, I can't even guess what type of phylum this organism belongs to. We were able to collect that specimen and send it to our partners over at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, but it still took months, almost a year, to determine that it was probably a new species of the latunid marine snail. So that one's a little, more of a macrofauna, but definitely the time frame is much longer than what we're used to perhaps seeing. We have had so many people write in, so please continue to send in your questions. We've got about 10 more minutes left. And let's actually take a look at what we're doing right now on the front porch of Herc. It looks like we're maybe rearranging some of the equipment.
Yeah, you can see the manipulator. That's the robotic arm on Hercules. It's controlled by the pilot up in the van who's moving around almost a marionette of that arm to control its movements. Right now they're stowing away some of these samplers that we use to collect the gas. So these are devices that are constructed or devised by a scientist and then helped by engineers to build them, and they're samplers that will collect that gas or a fluid and keep it at high pressure, because as the pressure decreases, some reactions might occur that would change the fundamental nature of that fluid. And you can see in the other manipulator the bubble capture device that was devised being held out in front of the vehicle. It probably still has some gas inside of it.
Wow, very cool. Okay, so maybe there are bubbles. Fingers crossed. That's awesome. Keep on sending your questions. Like I said, we've got about 10 minutes left. And Adam, what's it going to look like once we start getting closer to the surface? How our operations change?
Yeah, so we'll stow away some of those manipulators, keep everything tight on the vehicle. If you're looking at the video feed, you're going to see right now we're looking at lights from Hercules keeping the water lit up, but those can come off and the sunlight's going to light up the view. You're going to see a lot more marine organisms, and some of our recoveries, we've seen some mahi-mahi swimming around the vehicle. And above the vehicle, you can't see it right now, is another smaller ROV. This is a vehicle that is directly connected to the ship, and it moves up and down with the heave of the ship, and in between the two is a kind of a neutrally buoyant tether so that the ROV can remain stable even though this separate vehicle is moving up and down. So as they come on the ship, we're going to recover Argus, that upper, smaller ROV first, and bring the Hercules vehicle back towards the ship and pick it up with a crane and put it on deck. If you look at that video feed at the front of Herc right now, you can see the manipulator holding out a wand that is the inlet for a mass spectrometer and laser spectrometer. These are kind of new technologies. They're technologies that people have in the lab, but it's unusual or it's new for them to be able to be deployed in the deep sea. So at the end of that wand is a little inlet that's going to suck in fluids and deliver it back to the mass and laser spectrometer.
Yeah. And then, as we mentioned earlier, once the vehicles are back on the surface and secured down on deck, you'll see our entire science team come out with buckets and dishes ready to collect all of those samples.
It's a bit of a feeding frenzy. The scientists are really excited to see what they were looking at in the video screens on the seafloor to see it in real life. So there'll be a scientist crowding around the vehicle looking to get those samples off and start the processing, which, time is of the essence for some of them. For the biological samples, they need to be put into or kept cold so that they can stay alive as long as possible for the documentation of them.
Great. So in addition to seeing if bubbles are really going to be collected in the sample, what else are you excited for after this dive?
Well, I'm excited for the rocks. As a geologist, I love when we collect rocks and bring them to the surface. And from this dive, we collected some carbonate rocks. The fluids that are coming out contain a lot of carbon in the form of methane mostly. And some of that carbon is precipitated into carbonate rocks. And this is actually done by microbes. They oxidize the methane and results in production of these carbonates. So I'm really excited to see the carbonates come up.
Woohoo, carbonates. That one I don't think has been said before.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's ever said I'm really excited for the carbonates, but saw it first
Today
on
is the
Facebook.
day. Yeah. I'm really excited for the squid. Usually, as you mentioned before, in the top few hundred feet, as we're getting to the surface, it starts getting lighter. We start seeing a lot of different fish. We've been seeing mahi-mahi right off the deck, but then right near the surface, we'll get big schools of squid, and you can see their chromatophores changing, and they've actually been inking and leaving behind pseudomorphs, which are these clouds of ink that look like squid to kind of deter predators. So very excited. We've got about 5 minutes left, but we do encourage you to check out nautiluslive.org and actually watch the recovery, and then we'll be diving again later this afternoon. What is the plan for the rest of this expedition, Adam?
Yeah, so we have one dive left on this expedition. As you get to the end of an expedition, you try and pack in as much as possible. We're going to be returning to the site of the black smokers to try and recover some more samples, but we also, during our multi-beam mapping, found some more bubble plumes right near the black smokers. So we're pretty excited to go back to this site, hunt down those bubble plumes, and then get a look again at these beautiful black smokers and try and collect some more samples from them.
Awesome. The one last thing I'll mention is that if you have young explorers in your life, we have a Nautilus Expedition Patch Contest open now. So we are looking for artwork from young artists 6 to 14 years old to help us design our next expedition patch. So perhaps this year or next year it could be hydrothermal vents on the patch. That would be pretty cool. Yeah. You'll be back. We've got a couple of folks writing in asking us to post a photo and story about the carbonate rocks when they come up. So we'll definitely do that. We've got time for about 2 more questions before we wrap up. And this has been fantastic. We've had people tune in from all around the world. Thomas from Glasgow, Scotland. Hello from Glasgow and Scotland. And I think this is actually a pretty cool wrap-up question from Anusha. Do you have an idea about the size of the particles you observe at the vents and how they evolve when the plume rises in the water? Yeah, so the particles are they're very small. They're tens of microns, and they're kind of individual crystals of these sulfide minerals. The particles rise up in the plume of hot water to a level where the water becomes neutrally buoyant. So as you go up in the water column and the fluids cool off and the seawater warms up, they'll kind of spread out in a lens, and those particles will rain back down to the seafloor. When we were first at this site, we were hunting for those hydrothermal vents. One of the things we looked at was a almost a path of dark sand, and part of our efforts was to follow that path of sand, and that led us up to the hydrothermal vents. Very cool. Well, it looks like we're getting closer to the surface, so I think we're going to wrap up. But Adam, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today. Yeah, it's great. I love to share about ocean exploration and seafloor science, and I'm glad to see so many people are interested. Yeah, well, we'll be available to take your questions on nautiluslive.org, and we're going to throw it back to Kobe in the studio, who can tell you how to stay with us for the rest of the season. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you all for joining us today for our Facebook Live event. If you'd like to continue to follow us live for the rest of our season, or if you have any more questions that you'd like to ask our explorers, please feel free to visit our website at nautiluslive.org. And you can also find us on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.